The rain had been falling since before dawn, a slow, steady drizzle that made the streets of Fairview look like they were dipped in dull silver. By the time evening came, the wind had picked up, sweeping scraps of paper along the sidewalks and rattling the rusted sign that hung above Maggie's diner. Inside, the warm yellow light tried its best to chase away the gloom. The old jukebox in the corner hummed quietly, and the smell of fresh biscuits and frying bacon clung stubbornly to the air. At the far end of the counter, Maggie Lewis wiped down a mug for the third time. She didn't need to. It was already spotless. But keeping her hands busy made it easier to ignore the gnawing in her chest. Life had taught Maggie that stillness invited pain, and she'd had her fill of both. Widowed young, estranged from her only sibling, and scraping by as the lone black waitress in a town that still looked at her like she'd wandered in from another world, Maggie was no stranger to the quiet, sharp edges of loneliness. She'd been at the diner for nearly a decade now. It wasn't much, but it kept her fed, kept a roof over her head, and, on rare good days, gave her enough tips to buy something other than instant coffee. Mr. Hanley, the owner, was decent enough in public, but she'd learned to sidestep his temper and sharp comments when the till came up short or a customer complained. That night, the diner was almost empty. 2 truckers sat at a booth, talking low over steaming mugs, and a young couple shared a plate of fries near the window. Maggie's feet ached as she moved from table to table, but she kept her smile ready, the one she'd perfected over years of customer service, pleasant enough to be polite, distant enough to be safe. The front door creaked open just as she was refilling the trucker's coffee. A rush of cold air swept in, and 2 small figures appeared in the doorway. They hesitated under the glow of the neon open sign, their shoulders hunched against the rain. The boy looked about 11, thin as a fence post, his hair plastered to his forehead. Beside him, a girl no older than 8 clutched his sleeve, her pale face half hidden beneath a faded pink hoodie. Both wore clothes that had seen better days, threadbare sleeves, sneakers with frayed laces, and their eyes darted around the diner like they weren't sure they belonged there. Maggie's instincts stirred immediately. She'd seen that look before, the look of kids trying to be invisible because they'd learned the world didn't want them noticed. She started toward them, but before she could speak, Mr. Hanley stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "We're closing soon," he said curtly, his eyes narrowing. "Kitchen's done for the night. Move along." The boy straightened, his chin lifting with a quiet defiance. We can work for it," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "Wash dishes, sweep floors, anything. We just need something. To eat." Maggie saw the way Mr. Hanley's jaw tightened. "We're not a charity," he muttered. "Out!" Something inside Maggie snapped. She had kept her head down for years, swallowing every insult, letting the unfairness of it all slide past her because survival left no room for pride. But this, turning away 2 rain-soaked, hungry children, this she couldn't ignore. "Mr. Hanley," she said, her voice steady but low. "It's pouring out there. Let me fix them a plate. You can dock it from my pay." He glared at her, and for a moment she thought he'd refuse just to remind her who was in charge. But finally, with a dismissive wave, he muttered, "Do what you want. Just don't let them hang around." Maggie didn't waste time. She grabbed a clean towel and led the children to a booth in the far corner, away from the drafty door. "Sit," she said softly, draping the towel over the girls' shoulders. The boy slid into the seat first, his wary eyes never leaving hers, as though he was trying to decide if she was really as kind as she seemed. 5 minutes later, she set down 2 plates piled high with scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of fries. The quickest, heartiest thing she could make without attracting Mr. Hanley's grumbling. She added 2 mugs of hot chocolate, the steam curling up in little wisps. The girl's eyes went wide. "For us?" she asked in a voice so small Maggie had to lean in to hear. "For you," Maggie said, smiling gently. And no, you don't owe me anything. The boy hesitated, then picked up his fork. The first bite seemed to melt something in him, because soon both children were eating like they hadn't seen a full plate in days. Maggie didn't rush them. She just stood by, refilling their cocoa when it dipped low, pretending to busy herself with the counter so they wouldn't feel like charity cases. When they'd finished, the boy wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and murmured, "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "My name's Luke. This is my sister, Annie. Our mom's... she's sick. Real sick. We don't have much." Something in his voice, too old, too tired for a child, made Maggie's chest ache. She'd heard that tone before, in the mirror years ago, when she was young and struggling to survive after her husband's sudden death. She reached into her apron, pulled out a couple of wrapped biscuits she'd saved for herself, and pressed them into Annie's hands. "Take these," she said softly, "and come back if you need to." Luke's brow furrowed. "Won't your boss be mad?" Maggie glanced toward the kitchen, where Mr. Hanley's voice was rising in irritation over some burnt onions. "Probably," she said with a faint smile. "But some things are worth it." They left a few minutes later, disappearing into the rain. Maggie stood at the door long after they were gone, staring into the night as if she could still see their small figures moving down the slick sidewalk. Something told her she hadn't seen the last of them, and though she didn't know it yet, that quiet act of kindness, done in a half-empty diner on a rainy night, was about to change the course of all their lives forever. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still felt heavy, clinging to Fairview like a damp blanket. Maggie's shift at the diner was slow. Only a handful of customers trickled in for their morning coffee and pie. But her mind wasn't on coffee orders or Mr. Hanley's usual muttering. She kept seeing Luke and Annie's faces, pale and hungry, framed in that doorway the night before. She had told herself they might not come back, that maybe they had somewhere else to turn. But in her gut, she knew better. By the time her shift ended, she couldn't shake the thought of them. It wasn't just pity. It was something sharper, more urgent. She'd been on the receiving end of small mercies when she was at her lowest, and she knew how one act of kindness could stick like a lifeline in the dark. If she didn't follow up, she would always wonder what had happened to those two kids. She hung up her apron in the back and grabbed her coat. "Where are you running off to?" Mr. Hanley called after her as she stepped toward the door. "Errand," she said without slowing down. She didn't owe him more than that. Luke had mentioned, almost offhand, that they lived down near the old train yard on Willow Street. It wasn't the kind of area people in town talked about unless they were warning their kids where not to go. Half the houses were abandoned, windows boarded up, the lawns overtaken by weeds and rusted junk. Maggie's boots crunched over gravel as she turned down the narrow street, her breath clouding in the cool air. Number 14 was easy to spot, not because it looked worse than the others, but because it was the only one with a faint wisp of smoke curling from the crooked chimney. The paint was peeling in strips, and the porch leaned like it was too tired to stand straight. She stepped up carefully, avoiding the gap in the top stair. When she knocked, there was no answer at first. She was about to leave when she heard shuffling. Inside, then the sound of a lock sliding open. Luke appeared in the doorway, his eyes widening in surprise. "Maggie!" His voice was cautious, like he couldn't quite believe she'd come. "Hi, Luke," she said, her tone gentle. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd check in." He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped aside. "You can come in, but it's kind of messy." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly sour. The living room was small, just a sagging couch, a milk crate doubling as a table, and a threadbare rug. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor with a chipped mug, cupped in her hands, staring at the contents like she was trying to make them last forever. She smiled shyly when she saw Maggie. "Hi, sweet pea," Maggie said softly, crouching to Annie's level. "What's in the mug?" "Hot water," Annie said simply, as if that were normal. Maggie's stomach clenched. "Where's your mama?" Luke hesitated, then motioned toward a narrow hallway. "She's in bed. She's been sick a long time." Maggie followed him down the hall, each step creaking under her weight. The bedroom door was open, and the sight inside stopped her cold. On a thin mattress against the wall lay a woman who looked far too young to be in such a state. Her skin was pale and almost translucent, her cheeks hollow, her hair damp with sweat. Even with her eyes closed, Maggie could see the pain etched into every line of her face. A half-empty bottle of cough syrup sat on the floor beside her. "That's Mama," Annie whispered from the doorway. Maggie stepped closer, speaking softly. "Ma'am, I'm Maggie. I work at the diner. Your kids are good kids." The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settling on Maggie with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You fed them last night." "Yes, ma'am," Maggie said, "and I'll do it again if I need to." The woman, Clara as Luke introduced her, tried to sit up, but the effort left her coughing, violently. Maggie reached for a worn towel on the nightstand and held it out. "Easy," she murmured. "You need rest. Have you seen a doctor?" Clara shook her head faintly. "No money? No insurance? It's just the flu, maybe." But Maggie could see it wasn't just the flu. The sickness clung to her like a shadow, the kind that wouldn't leave without a fight. She sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the dip beneath her weight. "Clara, I'm not family, but if you'll let me, I want to help. Meals, groceries, whatever I can do." Clara's lips trembled. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Maggie said firmly. "It's community. And sometimes, we all need someone to stand in the gap." For a long moment, Clara didn't speak. Then with a faint nod, she murmured, "All right." By the time Maggie left that afternoon, she had promised Luke and Annie she'd be back with food that actually filled their bellies. On her walk home, she calculated how much she could spare from her next paycheck, knowing full well it wouldn't be enough. But she also knew she'd find a way, because something had shifted in her that day. Feeding them once was an act of kindness. Going back was a choice, and now she couldn't imagine turning her back on them. Not when she had seen their reality with her own eyes. As she closed the door to her small apartment that night, she realized she'd stepped into something bigger than she'd planned. She also knew this was only the beginning. The next week passed in a blur of exhaustion. Maggie's days started before sunrise, and by the time she trudged home after closing the diner, her feet burned so badly she could feel each step long after she'd sat down. But it wasn't her aching body that kept her up at night. It was the memory of Clara's hollow cheeks, Annie sipping hot water like it was a luxury, and Luke trying to hide the fact that he'd gone without eating so his sister could have more. Every evening after work, Maggie stopped by their house on Willow Street. Sometimes she brought soup from the diner, carefully packed into takeout containers she'd paid for out of her tips. Other times, she brought groceries, flour, eggs, potatoes, things that could stretch into meals if used wisely. Luke tried to help in any way he could, carrying bags inside, keeping Annie occupied so Clara could rest, even helping Maggie scrub the kitchen counter that had gone sticky from neglect. But despite the little improvements, Maggie could see Clara slipping further away. The coughing fits came more often, leaving her breathless and pale. Maggie recognized that kind of illness. Her own mother had gone through something similar years ago, a sickness they couldn't afford to treat until it was too late. One night, after the last customer left the diner, Maggie approached Mr. Hanley at the counter. She hated asking him for anything, but she was running out of options. "Mr. Hanley," she began cautiously, "could I pick up extra shifts? I need to make some more money." He looked at her over his glasses, his mouth curling into that smirk she hated. "And why would I do that? You already work 6 days a week. You're slow enough as it is." Her stomach nodded, but she kept her tone even. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll take the late shifts no one wants. I'll do the prep work and the cleanup." He leaned back on his stool, studying her like she was a puzzle he didn't feel like solving. "What's this for? You hiding? Some deadbeat boyfriend somewhere?" "No," she said firmly, meeting his eyes. "It's for a family who needs help." He snorted. "Figures. You're too soft for your own good, Maggie. That's why you're still stuck here." She felt the sting of his words but didn't flinch. After a long pause, he shrugged. "Fine, but don't expect me to go easy on you. And if your little side project gets in the way of my business, you're out." It wasn't kindness. It was control, but Maggie took it. More hours meant more money, even if it came at the cost of her body. For the next 2 weeks, she pushed herself harder than she had in years. She worked through double shifts, her hands raw from constant washing, her legs trembling after hours on her feet. She'd slip leftovers into her bag, careful not to let Mr. Hanley see, then make the half-hour walk to Willow Street after closing. Annie started greeting her at the door with a hug, her small arms wrapping around Maggie's waist like she never wanted to let go. Luke, though quieter, began to relax around her, sometimes staying up just to help carry in the food. One evening, Maggie arrived to find Luke pacing in the front yard, his eyes wide with panic. "She can't breathe right," he said before she could even say hello. "It's worse than before." Maggie didn't hesitate. She hurried inside, the air thick with the smell of damp blankets and sickness. Clara was propped up in bed, her lips tinged faintly blue. Each breath came with a wheeze that scraped against Maggie's nerves like sandpaper. "You need a doctor," Maggie said firmly. "We can't afford," Clara started, but Maggie cut her off. "Forget the bill. I'll handle it." It was a reckless promise. She had no idea how she'd pay for it, but she couldn't stand by and watch Clara fade away. She called the small clinic on Main Street, the one that didn't ask too many questions if you paid cash, and begged them to take Clara in that night. By the time the doctor had examined her, the news was worse than Maggie feared. "She's got pneumonia and it's advanced," the doctor said quietly while Clara rested. "She needs medication immediately, and she needs to rest somewhere warm and dry. This house won't help her recover." The prescription and visit emptied Maggie's wallet, and she walked out of the clinic with only a few crumpled bills left to her name. She didn't care. She bought the medicine, brought Clara home, and sat with her until the wheezing eased. That night, when she finally made it back to her apartment, Maggie sank into the couch, her head in her hands. She was stretched to the breaking point, financially, physically, emotionally. But when she pictured Annie's little smile or the way Luke stood guard by his mother's bed, she knew she'd do it all again. She was on borrowed time now, balancing her own survival against theirs. But Maggie had made her choice, and once she chose someone, she didn't let go. Winter hit Fairview with a vengeance. The wind came first, rattling the windows of the diner and cutting through coats like knives, and then the snow followed, thick, relentless, turning the streets into frozen ribbons of white. For most people, it meant cranking up the heat and staying indoors. For Maggie, it meant another obstacle. Every step to Willow Street after her late shift became a battle against the biting cold. Her boots, already worn thin, soaked through easily, leaving her toes numb by the time she reached Clara's house. Inside, the air wasn't much warmer. Clara's illness had eased slightly with the medication, but the sickness still clung to her in waves, making her too weak to get out of bed for long. The space heater in the corner was barely enough to keep the small bedroom livable, and Maggie noticed Luke had been stacking blankets on Annie at night instead of himself. He'd grown quieter again, his eyes shadowed with a worry no child should have to carry. Maggie's own world was unraveling. The extra shifts Mr. Hanley had granted came with an unspoken punishment. He barked at her for the smallest mistake, sent her back to redo orders, and made sly comments about how she owed him for letting her stay on. Her body ached in places she didn't know could hurt, and the circles under her eyes deepened until even the regulars started asking if she was sick. One particularly brutal night, she was rushing to deliver a plate to a table when her knees buckled beneath her. She caught herself on the counter, ignoring the sharp pain in her hip, and plastered on a smile. But Mr. Hanley saw. "Get it together, Maggie," he snapped from behind the register. "If you can't keep up, I can find someone who will." She bit back the retort that burned on her tongue. Losing this job wasn't an option. Not while 3 people depended on her. A few nights later, the crisis she'd been dreading arrived. It was just past closing when she noticed the snow piling up outside the diner's front window. She was wiping down the last table when the phone in her apron pocket buzzed. It was Luke. "Maggie?" His voice trembled. She's coughing bad, like Mama did. She can't stop." The sound of his panic punched through her exhaustion like ice water. "I'm on my way," she said, already pulling off her apron. Mr. Hanley stepped in her path. "Where do you think you're going?" "We're not done here. My shift's over," she said, reaching for her coat. "You're not leaving until the floors are mopped," he barked. "You want those extra hours? You earn them." Maggie froze, her heart hammering. Every instinct told her that arguing could cost her this job, but the image of Annie struggling to breathe burned in her mind. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "Fire me if you have to." Mr. Hanley's face went red, his mouth opening for another insult, but she was already pushing through the door into the freezing night. By the time she reached Willow Street, her hands were numb and her hair was damp from melting snow. Inside, the heat was barely on. Annie sat propped against a pillow, her cheeks flushed and her breath shallow. Luke hovered by her side, his small hands gripping the blanket like he could hold her together through sheer will. "It's okay, baby," Maggie murmured, kneeling beside the bed. She pressed a hand to Annie's forehead. It was burning hot. "We're going to the clinic," Luke's eyes widened. "But we don't have—" "Doesn't matter," she said sharply. "Get her coat." The clinic visit blurred into a haze of bright lights and antiseptic. The doctor confirmed what Maggie already feared. Annie had developed pneumonia, too. They caught it early, but she'd need antibiotics, rest, and warmth. Maggie paid for the medicine with the last of her savings, her hands trembling as she handed over the bills. When they returned home, she tucked Annie into bed, then stepped into the kitchen. Luke followed her, his voice small. "You left work for us." She smiled faintly, though her chest ached. "Of course I did." "What, if you lose your job?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. Maggie crouched, so she was eye level with him. "Jobs come and go, Luke. But you, Annie, you're not replaceable." For the first time since she'd met him, Luke's eyes softened, not just with gratitude, but with something deeper. Trust. That night, Maggie walked back to her apartment. Through the snow, unsure if she still had a job, unsure how she'd pay her rent next month. But for the first time in weeks, the heaviness in her chest eased. Because no matter what came next, she knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. She had chosen them, and she'd choose them again. 15 winters came and went in Fairview, each one leaving its quiet mark on Maggie's life. The house on Willow Street no longer leaned tiredly toward the earth. Fresh paint brightened its siding, and the crooked porch had been replaced with sturdy steps that didn't groan beneath your weight. Clara had passed away the spring after Annie's illness, her final days eased by the constant presence of Maggie's voice, reading to her by lamplight, and Luke's quiet devotion, sitting vigil at her bedside. The grief had been sharp, but it had fused Maggie, Luke, and Annie into something unshakable. The years that followed were not easy, but they were theirs. Maggie never did get her job back at the diner after that snowy night, but she found work in the town bakery. The pay was smaller, but the hours were kinder, and the owner didn't make her choose between decency and employment. She stretched every dollar, mended every shirt, and learned the art of doing without for herself, so Luke and Annie could have what they needed. Luke grew into a man faster than he should have, working part-time jobs after school, then earning a scholarship that carried him to a nearby university. Annie's laughter, once fragile as a bird's wing, returned in full, her natural gift for drawing winning her a place at an art academy. They left Fairview one after the other, promising to visit, promising to call, and they did, though Maggie never told them how quiet the house felt after their visits ended. The truth was, Maggie never expected anything in return. She had given them her best years, not because she hoped for repayment, but because she couldn't imagine doing anything else. They were her family. The life she'd once dreamed of, a husband, children of her own, had been replaced with a different, harder kind of love. But to her, it had been worth it 1,000 times over. On a crisp autumn morning, years later, Maggie sat on the small porch of her own home, a modest two-bedroom place she'd managed to buy with decades of careful saving. She was sipping coffee, the steam curling against the cool air, when she heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drive. A sleek black car pulled up, unfamiliar against the backdrop of worn pickup trucks and old sedans in her neighborhood. The driver's door opened, and Luke stepped out. She knew him instantly, though the boy she remembered had been replaced by a broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit. His smile was warm, but it was his eyes, the same steady, watchful eyes that made her rise to her feet without thinking. "Maggie," he said, crossing the yard in long strides. And then he hugged her tight, unhurried, like someone anchoring himself to a place he'd missed. Before she could find words, another door opened. Annie emerged, her hair swept up, wearing a dress that looked like it had come straight from an art gallery opening. In her hands, she carried a flat, wrapped package. "What in the world?" Maggie began, but Annie was already pressing it into her hands. "Open it," she urged. The paper fell away to reveal a painting. It was Maggie's kitchen, small, humble, but painted in warm golden light. At the table sat a younger version of herself, setting down a steaming plate before 2 rain-soaked children. The scene was alive with detail. The towel draped over Annie's shoulders, the way Luke's eyes were fixed on the food, the faint smile tugging at Maggie's lips. And behind it all, the glow of safety, of being seen. Maggie's throat tightened. "You remembered." "We never forgot," Luke said quietly. "Everything we've become, doctors, artists, whatever titles we carry, it's because you stepped in when no one else did." Annie's eyes glistened. "And we came to tell you it's our turn now." Maggie blinked at them. "Your turn for what?" Luke glanced toward the car, then back at her. "To take care of you the way you took care of us. We've bought you a new place in town, close to everything, no more struggling to keep up with. Repairs. And there's more. We've set up a fund, so you never have to work another day unless you want to." The words landed slowly like snow settling on the ground. Maggie shook her head, her instinct to refuse rising fast. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do," Luke interrupted gently. "You gave us a life. Let us make sure the rest of yours is easy." For the first time in years, Maggie felt her knees weaken. Not from exhaustion, but from the sheer weight of gratitude pressing back against the decades she'd carried alone. She pulled them both into her arms, her voice breaking. "I don't need your money, but I will take your company." "Then you'll have both," Annie said fiercely. "No arguments." They spent the afternoon together. The car ride, into town filled with stories and laughter that erased the years of distance. When they arrived at the new house, sunlight streaming across polished floors and a kitchen that smelled faintly of fresh paint, Maggie realized it wasn't the size or beauty of the place that overwhelmed her. It was the knowledge that she would never again have to wonder if someone would be there for her in the way she had once been there for them. That night, as they sat on the porch together, Luke handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a simple note. Family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who stands beside you when the world tries to leave you behind. Maggie looked at them, her boy with the steady eyes, her girl with the artist's hands, and felt the quiet truth settle deep inside her. She had given them a home when they had none. And now they had returned, not just to repay her, but to remind her that love, once given freely, has a way of finding its way back.